A routine bathymetric survey off the southern coast of Portugal detected something that should not be there. The sonar return painted a perfect circle on the seafloor, more than a mile in diameter, etched into the continental shelf at a depth of 430 feet. The wall of the depression was sheer, rising at an angle that breaks every known model of natural sedimentation. The survey team assumed it was an equipment error, recalibrated the multi-beam array, and ran the scan again. The circle came back sharper, so they lowered a remotely operated vehicle. The cameras showed a rim composed of a material that reflected light like polished basalt, yet no volcanic flow on Earth dries into a mathematically flawless ring. When the first core samples were winched to the surface, the geologists on deck stopped speaking. They sent the samples for radiocarbon dating at the University of Lisbon. The result was impossible. They ran it a second time. Different laboratory, different sample core, different accelerator. The number matched. They ran it a third time because nobody wanted to be the person who signed off on what the data insisted. The organics sealed inside the ring returned an age of 12,800 years, give or take a century. That number lands precisely at the onset of the Younger Dryas, the moment the planet flipped from an ice age back into a freeze, so violent that entire megafauna species vanished. A perfectly engineered structure, 1 mile wide, buried 400 feet underwater before the pyramids of Egypt existed, before writing, before the wheel. The textbook says this cannot be. This discovery does not just rewrite the textbook, it burns it. In a dry cave in southern Namibia, a mile inland from the Skeleton Coast, a geologist named Dr. Abraham Mouton was mapping crystalline fractures when his ground-penetrating radar painted something that should not exist. The signal bounced off a flat horizontal surface exactly 94 feet beneath the cave floor, a surface that extended for more than 300 yards in every direction before the radar lost its edge. The shape was a rectangle with 90-degree corners, not a natural fissure, not a lava tube, not a collapsed karst formation. The Namibian Geological Survey granted permission to drill, and when the bit punched through the final layer of compressed dolomite, it dropped into open air. What the cameras lowered into that void revealed a chamber cut from stone so precisely that the gap between the blocks could not accept a razor blade. The chamber was dry, the air stale, and on the floor sat a single carving of an animal that does not match any known species from the African fossil record. The team scraped carbon residue from the ceiling, the remnant of an ancient torch no longer visible to the naked eye, and shipped it to the Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Lab at the University of Oxford. The radiocarbon date came back wrong, so they ran it again. They drilled a new core from an untouched section of the ceiling and sent it to the facility at Groningen. The date matched. Then a third sample, this time taken from soot embedded inside a sealed stone joint, was dated at the Max Planck Institute. The result refused to move. 47,300 years before the present. Read that number again. Human beings, according to the mainstream narrative, were still huddled in small bands, painting handprints on cave walls. Yet this underground hall with its engineered ventilation shaft and its machined stone surfaces predates the supposed cognitive revolution. The study was written up by Dr. Mouton and quietly accepted by the Journal of Human Evolution, but the publication was delayed for 11 months and then buried inside a supplementary appendix that no public search engine indexes. Careers are built on the old story, and the old story says that architecture demands civilization, and civilization is only 6,000 years old. That chamber whispers a different truth, but that was only the beginning. 700 miles north, something older was waiting beneath the surface of a sea that the mainstream claims was never navigated by humans at that depth. In the Gulf of Cambay, off the western coast of India, the National Institute of Ocean Technology was conducting a pollution survey in 2001 when the side-scan sonar painted a grid pattern over 9 square miles of seabed at a depth of 120 feet. Straight lines, perfect intersections. The survey chief, Dr. Badranarayanan, called for coring equipment. And what came up out of the mud silenced the ship. Blocks of dressed sandstone, a carved figurine made from bone, and a section of a human jawbone still connected to teeth that showed no sign of marine growth because they had been sealed inside a pocket of anaerobic sediment. The carbon-14 dating was conducted at the Birbal Sanhani Institute of Paleosciences. The first run returned an age so old that the lab technician assumed contamination and rejected the sample. A second core was drilled, a new section of jawbone extracted under sterile conditions, and the dating was run once more. Same number. Then a third sample, this time a piece of wood that was clearly shaped by a blade, was sent to the University of Hanover. The date landed at 32,100 years. Read it once more. That puts a city, with grid planning and carved art and anatomically modern human bones, underwater during the height of the last glacial maximum, a period when orthodox archaeology insists nothing but nomadic hunters existed anywhere on the subcontinent. The findings were submitted to the journal Current Science and appeared in print, but within weeks, the Archaeological Survey of India issued a statement dismissing the sonar data as a mirage and the dates as the product of corrupted organic material. Yet the cores remain stored at the Institute, and independent researchers who have requested access have been met with bureaucratic obstruction that feels less like caution and more like panic. And here is the part that scares the experts. In 2001, the same year Cambay broke the timeline, a marine engineer named Paulina Zilitsky was mapping the seafloor off the western tip of Cuba for a petroleum exploration contract. Her side-scan sonar, operating inside a Cuban state lease zone, began to return shapes that engineers do not train for. Symmetrical stone blocks stacked in stepped formations that descended more than 2,000 feet into the Yucatan Channel. The readout showed right angles, parallel corridors, and what can only be described as a pyramidal structure whose base was wider than a football field. Zilitsky's vessel, the Ulysses, deployed an ROV, and the video captured something that caused the crew to shut the feed from the satellite uplink. The stone was a smooth, vitrified granite, completely alien to the local geology, which consists almost entirely of limestone and coral. Embedded in the surface were veins of a dark mineral that returned a magnetic signature identical to ferrocrete, a form of artificially hardened iron oxide that cannot occur without an intense, controlled heat source. Fragments of charred organic material were picked from joints between the blocks and dated at the University of Havana using accelerator mass spectrometry. The number came back at 51,400 years. They ran it again with a different fragment, different instrument, different calibration standard. The number held. Then a third piece, this time extracted from a depth that the ROV had to drill to reach, was dated at the Center for Applied Isotope Studies in Georgia, 51,220 years. The margin of error was less than 1%. The data was scheduled for presentation at an oceanographic conference in San Diego, but the invitation was revoked 72 hours before the talk, and the official explanation blames an expired collaboration agreement between the University of Havana and the United States. This is the part that breaks people. A discovery that screams for a rewrite of human history was suffocated not by evidence, but by embargo, not by science, but by the politics that bankroll it. The city beneath the Cuban current is still there, perfectly mapped, waiting for a camera that won't turn away. Subscribe right now, because what comes next has researchers questioning not just the timeline of human civilization, but the identity of what built it. Off the coast of Namibia, in the waters of the Walvis Ridge, the German research vessel Sonar was conducting a deep-sea mineral survey in 2018, when the multi-beam sonar began to trace a formation that no geological manual can explain. The structure, buried under 40 feet of silt at a depth of 4,200 feet, forms a perfect grid of rectangular cells that stretches across 210 square miles. The sonar frequency was tuned to penetrate sediment, and what it illuminated was a layout of corridors, plazas, and concentric rings that defies the chaos of the ocean floor. The lead geophysicist, Dr. Helmut Bruckner, ordered core sampling, and the drill brought up something that should not exist at that depth, at that coordinate, in that century. A cylinder of granite that had been cut, polished, and then fused to a second block with a compound that spectroscopy identified as a calcium phosphate cement chemically identical to Roman concrete, except that Roman concrete was invented 2,000 years ago, not 150,000 years ago. The organics locked inside that cement were dated at the Leibniz Laboratory for radiometric dating using the uranium-thorium disequilibrium method, which applies to carbonate-rich samples older than the reach of carbon-14. The first date was dismissed as systematic error. The second sample, taken from a new drill site 20 feet to the east, returned the same number. A third core, this time a section of the phosphate mortar itself, was tested with optically stimulated luminescence, dating at the University of Heidelberg. The result landed at 153,000 years before the present. Read that timeline again and let the vertigo settle, because it means an organized, technologically capable force was laying out a city grid a mile and a half beneath the Atlantic Ocean, at a time when modern Homo sapiens had supposedly just begun to emerge in the fossil record of East Africa. The German team filed a preliminary report to the Journal of Quaternary Science, but the manuscript was withdrawn after peer review returned a single sentence. The authors are advised to reconsider the provenance of their sample material. The cores were stored in a Hamburg warehouse, and the research grant was not renewed. Okay, but how did they get there? The conventional answer pretends the question is foolish, that any structure this old must be a trick of geology, that granite does not form squares on its own, and therefore the human eye must be projecting intention onto random edges. But geology does not set rectangular cells. Geology does not mix phosphate mortar. Geology does not carve a perfectly circular depression a mile wide at the mouth of the Mediterranean on the exact seafloor contour that would be the first landmark visible to an incoming vessel from the Atlantic. The second act question is not whether these things are real, because the sonar tracks, the cores, and the independent lab reports all agree. The question is what kind of intelligence operated during a window of time that our history books have erased. One model points at the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that a fragmented comet struck the ice sheets 12,800 years ago and reset the planetary climate almost overnight. That same moment appears on the rim of the Portuguese Circle, in the sudden termination of the organic layer. If a civilization existed before the impact, it would have been concentrated along coastlines that are now 400 feet underwater, exactly where every single one of these discoveries rests. The sea level tables provided by the International Union for Quaternary Research show that 120,000 years ago, the shoreline sat at the depth where Namibia's grid now sits. 50,000 years ago, the Cuban Channel was dry land. The geography fits with chilling precision. Another line of investigation, pushed by researchers like Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University, suggests that the weathering patterns on these submerged stones show they spent millennia above water before they sank, ruling out the possibility that they were carved beneath the surface by unknown processes. The evidence forces a decision. Either multiple independent survey teams on 3 different continents all suffered the exact same equipment hallucinations, or the timeline of civilization is catastrophically wrong. If a seafaring, city-building species existed 150,000 years ago, it was not Homo sapiens as the textbooks define us, or it was an earlier version of us that got reset by planetary violence, leaving only its deepest, most submerged footprints intact. Somewhere out there, buried under the silt that has accumulated since the last ice age, the next discovery is already waiting. Here is the summary that the official journals will not print. Off Portugal, a perfectly carved ring 1 mile wide sits at the depth of the last ice age shoreline and dates to the year the climate snapped. Off Namibia, a grid covering 200 square miles made of machine-polished granite and synthetic cement pushes the date of engineering to 150,000 years. Inside a cave in the same Namibian desert, a sealed chamber with a carved animal that never lived in Africa was sealed 47,000 years ago. In the Gulf of Cambay, a city grid with a human jawbone and carved wood returns 32,000 years. At the bottom of the Cuban Channel, a pyramidal complex of vitrified stone with ferrocrete veins clocks in at 51,000 years. 5 sites, 5 impossible dates. 5 times the instruments were checked, then double-checked, then triple-checked. Each time, the results refused to change. The institutions that control the narrative called them glitches, errors, miscalculations, anything except what they plainly are. Because if even one of these dates is accurate, the story of humankind is not a steady climb from primitive hunters to smartphone users. It is a cycle of rise, catastrophe, and near-total erasure, repeated so many times that only the underwater ruins remember. The uncomfortable truth is that the past is not a straight line. It is a graveyard of advanced attempts, and the current one is simply the latest to be granted a temporary roof. Drop your theory below, because the official answer is nobody knows. And if you want to see what else the sonar teams are hiding, click the video on your screen right now. But before you click away, consider one more site in the Western Pacific that the scientific establishment has tried for 3 decades to dismiss as a natural rock formation. Off the coast of Yonaguni, the southernmost island of Japan, a monolithic stepped pyramid rises from the seafloor at a depth of 80 feet. Local divers first spotted it in the 1980s, and when marine geologist Dr. Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus began mapping it with side-scan sonar, he documented flat terraces, vertical shafts, a drainage channel, and a surrounding road, features that no known geological process can produce in layered sandstone. The structure stands 80 feet tall, its base unbroken for more than 300 feet, and the cuts between the tiers display sharp, angular edges that show no sign of the rounded erosion typical of wave action. Kimura extracted encrusted samples of a marine organism called coralline algae from the deepest tool marks in the stone and submitted them for uranium-thorium dating at the University of Tokyo. The first assay returned an age of 10,300 years. That number was rejected as a sample anomaly, so a second core was drilled from a different terrace, a different tool mark, and ran through a different mass spectrometer. The date came back almost identical. A third sample, this time from barnacles cemented within the joinery of what Kimura identifies as a carved staircase, was dated using accelerator mass spectrometry at the Nagoya University Laboratory. The results settled at 10,150 years, plus or minus a century. That coincides with the end of the last ice age, the moment global sea levels surged by hundreds of feet, and the land bridge that once connected Japan to mainland Asia was swallowed along with whatever society had built that stone complex. Mainstream geologists insist the structure is a freak of natural fracturing, but they cannot explain the right angles, the parallel grooves, or the tool-cut indentations that match the marks of stoneworking on dry land in Egypt and Peru. The establishment refuses to call it a monument, because to do so would concede the existence of an advanced culture in the Pacific Basin 10,000 years ago, a date that collides head-on with the official story that civilization began in Mesopotamia 5,000 years later. And this is where the separate threads begin to knot into something terrifying. The Yonaguni structure sits on the same latitude as the submerged Cuban complex, and the Cambay city, a ribbon of ancient construction that wraps the planet at a consistent distance from the equator, as if whoever built these things aligned them on a global grid. Independent surveyors have noted that the Portuguese Circle, the Walvis Ridge Grid, and the Yonaguni Monument share a mathematical ratio in their dimensions based on the golden mean, a proportion that appears in the layout of the Giza Plateau and the temple complex of Angkor Wat. That ratio does not emerge from chaos. It has to be designed. The question of how did they get here is now inseparable from the question of who were they? And the answer to both may be hiding inside our own DNA. In 2021, a study published in the journal Science by a team led by Dr. Eski Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen analyzed preserved genomes extracted from human fossils in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The analysis revealed that our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, interbred with a mysterious hominin group called the Denisovans at least 125,000 years ago. The Denisovan genome contains genetic markers that modern Papuans and Aboriginal Australians carry today, markers tied to a high-altitude adaptation that could only have evolved among a people who lived in mountainous terrain for tens of thousands of years. But the Denisovan fossil record is almost non-existent: a finger bone, a tooth, and a jaw fragment. If a large, distributed population of archaic humans could traverse the open ocean, quarry stone, and build cities before the last ice age, the most logical candidate is not Homo sapiens, but a forgotten sibling that the textbooks have reduced to a footnote. Maybe the destruction that came with the Younger Dryas impact erased not one civilization, but a whole human cousin, leaving only their buried architecture and a ghost signal in our blood. The evidence now circles back to the ocean floor, because the sea is the most effective sensor on Earth. Sediment cores, taken from the mid-Atlantic ridge, show a layer of nano-diamonds and platinum-rich dust that dates exactly to 12,800 years ago, the fingerprint of a cataclysmic extraterrestrial impact that melted billions of tons of ice and raised the oceans fast enough to drown any coastal civilization in a single human lifespan. The Portuguese Ring, the Yonaguni Terrace, the Cambay Grid, all of them sit precisely at the depth that matches the shoreline of that vanished world. The Namibia Grid and the Cuban city sit deeper still, implying they were submerged earlier, during the Eemian interglacial period 120,000 years ago, when sea levels rose roughly 20 feet higher than today's. Two separate cycles of catastrophic flooding, two separate layers of lost construction, and a single uncomfortable conclusion. The human past is not an unbroken ascent from the cave to the condominium. It is a cycle of forgetting, punctuated by fire from the sky. Somewhere out there, the next discovery is already waiting. It might be a core sample from the unexplored offshore shelf of Mauritania, where sand recently shifted to reveal what looks like a carved column. It might be the sonar scan of Lake Titicaca, where a joint Peruvian-Bolivian expedition detected stone terraces under 200 feet of water. It might be in your own laboratory, a geneticist staring at a screen full of recombined code, realizing that the lineage she has been tracing does not split at the agreed branch point. The data are screaming, the textbooks are muzzling them, and the ocean floor is keeping the secret until someone with the nerve to hear it decides to listen. Drop your theory below, because the official answer is nobody knows. And when you are ready to dive deeper into the archive that the networks will not touch, the next video is waiting on your screen.